So this story just came out a few days ago that there's been a proposal set forth in Congress to revoke the 230 protections of big tech, hopefully in order to prevent big tech censorship. I'm going to go over like the basics of that bill and what's being proposed right now, but first, for anyone who's not familiar, just to give like a really quick breakdown of what current 230 protection is. This essentially refers to Section 230 of the Communications Act of 1996. And essentially, at the time, this was crafted well before the days of social media. And at the time, this was more in reference to the telephone companies, offering them legal protection. Essentially, the telephone companies were not responsible for things people said on the phone. Now, this is being applied currently to social media companies because they're also communications companies, even though this was drafted well before their existence. But they're being offered this legal shield because they are platforms. Or at least that's what they are supposed to be. But recently, with all the censorship, they're behaving more as publishers. So even though they're acting as publishers, censoring ideas and political opinions, they're still reaping the benefits of being platforms. And that's what this bill is aimed to do, is to remove those protections for the companies that do behave as publishers when in fact they are and should be platforms. So here's a quick breakdown. This is like the bare bones overview of the proposal. This is from Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. And seeing the headline here, to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to limit interactive computer service immunity. And I think that's, so the Communications Act was initially drafted in 1934, but I believe it was expanded upon in the Communications Indecency Act of 1996, and that's where 230 comes into play, though I'm not completely certain about that. Right now, the bill has one co-sponsor. My concern is that nothing will become of this, or it won't be carried out much further, because at least from my observation, it seems abundantly obvious that most of the establishment politicians, especially Democrats, are in bed with big tech. Biden is bringing in a cabinet full of tech lobbyists. And if you were to go back, or if you happen to watch the Senate hearings that called on the CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, and the CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, to testify, all of the Democrats' so-called questioning was all essentially, why wasn't there more censorship? Why don't you bear down even harder on our political opponents and censor more people who disagree with us? In other words, we're going to give you unlimited power of censorship as long as you use it to censor our political opponents, as long as you use it to benefit us. And we also saw, again, what looked to me to be pretty clear collusion between big tech and the Democratic Party when the laptop story was censored. Not even sure how much I can say about that without being censored myself. That's how bad it's gotten. But you know what I'm talking about, when a laptop that belonged to a certain politician's son revealed some pretty bad stuff about him that also implicated his father. That story was almost immediately censored and suppressed by Facebook and Twitter, which are the two absolute worst offenders when it comes to censorship. Which I always find it funny that some people on the political left will accuse Facebook of having a right-leaning bias. And it's like, if you really believed that, you would be against censorship, you would be against their powers, and you would be for free speech. But they're not, because they really know it's mainly conservatives getting censored. And here's where the trick comes into play. Because people are willing to give up their own future free speech, their own voice, their own rights, for some hollow, perceived political victory. That's the worst thing right now, is that we are being convinced that the government is not a group of people that are elected to serve its citizens, that should all be serving us. No, it's just a left versus a right. That's the trick. That's the deception. Combine this with the fact that the mainstream media is pretty much completely in the pocket of the donor class and works exclusively to empower the politicians that represent that donor class, that receive the vast majority of their funding and support from that class. Essentially, it works a little something like this. Trillionaire special interest groups donate large sums of money to certain politicians. Then they use the media outlets that they own to prop up that candidate while slandering and attacking that candidate's opposition. Then they work in coordination with the billionaires of tech to further control how people react to that, to further control the narrative and manipulate public opinion. And that's the 1-2 punch. First, the mainstream media pushes the narrative, then it carries over to social media where people react to it, where those who react favorably to the establishment narrative are propped up, and those who resist are censored and silenced. That's how public opinion is manipulated and controlled. That's why I'm always saying the mainstream media has come together with big tech to form the most powerful propaganda machine this world has ever known. People consider our media to be a free press because the press isn't run by the government. But it's pretty absurd to call it that, because even though it's not run by the government, it's almost entirely controlled by a small ruling class that essentially owns the government. The end result is exactly the same. Anyway, I wanted to get to this bill, though for reasons I've stated, I'm skeptical as to how far it will go. That being said, it's a recent proposal, so we'll have to see. And you can find more information about it here. This is gabbard.house.gov. So the main thing I wanted to point out here is, it just says, introduce this act, the Break Up Big Tech Act of 2020, which would remove the Section 230 legal immunity shield that protects interactive computer service providers like big tech monopolies and social media companies who engage in certain manipulative practices, including acting as publishers and censoring certain users. And here's the thing, here's the important thing. When it comes to reform and not repeal, we want it to be this way. We want it to be conditional. We only want to take away these 230 protections when these social media companies act as publishers instead of behaving as neutral, unbiased platforms. So we want to see those conditions. That's a good thing, as long as it plays out that way, which it's always difficult to say what their true intentions are, if things are truly made in good faith. This seems hopeful. But again, it's always good to have a skeptical mind. So when I talked earlier about the politicians, mainly the Democrats, who seem to be pushing for more censorship, that's another concern I have. Not only the fact that that's absurd and appears to be obvious collusion, but I see bills like this and I wonder if it's a power play, if they're somehow trying to leverage this into full government control over big tech, which I don't think. It doesn't seem that way, especially not at this point. But that is another thing we don't want, because we don't want the government to be in control of the propaganda machine. We want the government to ensure that these massive social media platforms cannot serve as propaganda machines, to ensure that the public square itself, and that's what social media has become. It's where people get a lot of their information. That's where most of interaction happens. So to ensure that the public square itself remains open and neutral, with no elevation or suppression or interference, so that public opinion is free, open, and not artificially manipulated. So again, one last time, we don't want to repeal 230, we want to reform it. Repealing 230 would essentially make all these companies legal publishers with no immunity, which would likely cause much more censorship. They need and want those 230 protections, so we want to set up conditions where they will lose those if they behave, as it says here, if they engage in certain manipulative practices, if they're censoring certain users, if they're censoring certain ideas. So this is relatively new. This was released December 9th. We'll see where it goes, hopefully somewhere.